right, I think I'll start by introducing our next speaker, Professor Heather Street-Salter, Professor of History and Director of World History Programs at Northeastern University. She's interested in the histories of imperialism and anti-colonial movements, and deeply interested in pedagogy and world history pedagogy as well. And I must add, one of the most fabulous mentors on the planet. On a personal disclosure, she was one of my professors, and if everything I wanted to know about the profession, but was afraid to ask, I asked of Heather. She's the author of Martial Races, The Military Race and Masculinity in British Imperial Culture, 1857 to 1914, 2014, from Manchester University Press. The book examines the rise of martial race ideology in the aftermath of the Indian Revolt of 1857. And the book also talks about Scottish Highlanders and the Punjabi Sikhs and the Nepalese Gurkhas. Heather recently published an edited volume with Ares Manila, The Anti-Colonial Transnational, published in 2023 from Cambridge University Press, which examines the transnational and global dimensions of anti-colonial activism and solidarity. Our paper today is on historiographical convergences in the making of a global history of anti-colonialism.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, you thought that's what it was about. It's sort of about that. I have a timer, by the way, so start my 15 minutes. It turns out as I was writing this paper, it became just a vehicle for talking about the field of global history and also the sort of relationship of world history to it. So I want to make sure, and Amitava did a nice job of locating me, but I want to make sure that you understand that I'm coming to this conference very much from the field of world history. I've been the director of world history PhD programs since 2003, first at Washington State University and then still at Northeastern University in Boston. I was trained as a historian of the British Empire, but I've really, for the last, about 15 years, I have been very much immersed in world history, the field of world history, the historiography of world history, and it really changed the things that I asked about history and the questions that I had about sources. Also emboldened me to go beyond what I thought I was actually qualified to do, emboldened me to go to different kinds of archives, to learn new languages. And so just to think beyond what I thought I was originally trained for and what I really was trained for. So my first book, Martial Races, was not really, you can't consider it, I don't think, a world history. But my second book, World War I in Southeast Asia, I very much do consider a world history. It's really about anti-colonialism, and using the moment of World War I as an opportunity to try to undermine empires. And then Amitava mentioned the previous two, actually Disha is here. She has an essay in this book, The League Against Imperialism, Lives and Afterlives, and then the Anti-Colonial Transnational with Ares Manila. Really sort of got at that idea of the collaborative in thinking about these global movements. Settler colonialism could be one, but certainly anti-colonialism is another, because you need so much training and so many languages and so many areas of specialty to start to think about this as a global phenomenon. Okay, so that's just full disclosure of where I'm coming from intellectually. So the paper I submitted is a very incomplete and very drafty account of the extraordinary growth, in my opinion, and development and change in the histories of anti-colonial movements. Very generally, I argue that these histories have moved more and more from exploring these movements in the context of individual empires, and instead to exploring the ways that anti-colonial movements drew on extranational connections, on networks, and on organizations, not only to formulate their goals, but also to attempt to realize them. So what I say in the paper, I promise I'm not going to bore you very long with this, but what I say in the paper is that I see this development as a convergence of several different historiographies that have different origins, but ended up having a lot to say to one another. So on the one hand, I see the historiographies of imperialism and colonialism in a variety of fields, which include the British Empire, but also the French and the Dutch and increasingly US Empire. And then on the other hand, the historiography of international history. So in the paper, I begin to trace these historiographies, though they are still quite incomplete. It would take a long time and longer than I had in order to finish it. But I'm trying to show that they came out of quite different foundations. So from imperialism and colonialism, we see like the post-Saidian recognition of the interlinked nature of metropoles and colonies, and then the gradual expansion of these ideas outside of individual empires altogether. And then in the case of international history, we see that it comes from the history of American foreign relations. Actually, Rez Manella has a great article on this. It comes from the history of foreign relations to the expansion beyond U.S. bilateral relations to a huge variety of relationships between various states and colonies and non-state actors. The result, I think, is a really vibrant set of works that are asking new and creative questions about anti-colonialism as a really global phenomenon. And more is coming out all the time. And I think this is especially true from relatively recent PhDs who are actually, this is their dissertation, and then it's going to be their first book. So it looks like a great trajectory for the future of a lot of work in this vein. Okay, so this is endlessly fascinating to me, as you can maybe hear, but I'm not going to go into detail about these historiographies because they may not be endlessly fascinating to all of you. But more importantly, I think in the context of a field-defining workshop on global history, I realized that as I was writing this, I have actually a number of questions, and some of them might even be concerns, that came out of this exercise. And since there are a number of PhD students here, and I'm really glad that you are, I hope that some of you will also have something to say about these questions and concerns. And so I'm actually really hoping to totally keep to my time so that we can really have a lot of discussion about these questions. Okay, so one of the things that I realized is when I was thinking about these historiographies is that academics who self-identify as world historians haven't actually played a very important role in this outpouring of work on global anti-colonial networks. So I thought that was very interesting, and I have things to say about this, and I'd be happy to talk about them in the discussion. But that got me to thinking about another issue, which I think is even more important, which is what is the role, the relationship between world and global history? So I think some of the people who are writing these cool histories of global anti-colonialism might identify as global historians, but not as world historians. And I think that's odd. So I want to play with that a little bit. So I've noticed a tendency to differentiate between these two fields by those calling themselves global historians, especially from people who call themselves global historians, but from the self-identified field of the world history community, these differences don't actually have that much significance anymore. It used to be a big debate, but now it's not a big debate. And I just wonder if this is not doing justice to the importance of the historiography of the field of world history with all its problems, but also all of its innovations in the project of global history. So I have questions about that. And I also wonder if labeling the field global history is a way to distance current practitioners, especially from R1 universities, from what many believe is a not very scholarly field of world history that associates too much with teachers and teaching. So this is not an accusation, by the way. It's just a question and something that I think would be worthwhile to discuss. Because one of the things that I really fully believe is that most self-identified world historians who are practicing now, writing books and things like that, would fully identify with the characteristics of global history that's outlined by the Global History Initiative or by Sebastian Conrad, for example, in What is Global History? So then that got me to thinking that, so world history has a historiography. As I've been teaching the course for 21 years, actually, and I missed only 2 years while I was on different sabbaticals. International history has a historiography. Histories of empire have a historiography. So what's the historiography of global history? Does global history have a specific historiography? Or what are the foundations, the historiographical foundations that global historians trace their genealogy, from which they trace their genealogy? Is it the same as, or does it overlap with world history? Are we actually talking about two different things, or are we talking about something that is the same? So again, this is a question, and I think something that is worth discussing in the context of this workshop. So I guess the last thing is that, if they're separate, is global history something that you just do? Is it a thing that you practice, but it doesn't have like a genealogy? Or, and if that's the case, how do you train PhD students to do global history if you're not, if you don't have like a historiography, and like, what are the mechanisms? How should we be training PhD students to do global history or world history? I actually think this is, since the global turn, this is a really important question because, 20 years ago, you could only go to a couple of different places, Northeastern being one of them, if you wanted to do world history, if you wanted to do something that really went beyond the bounds. But now I think you can do it in many different places, and it's not really super uncool anymore either. And so, what is then the future of training PhD students in this field, if indeed it is a field? And so I'm going to stop there. I didn't, my timer hasn't gone off yet. So I actually made my time, and I want to stop there because I really do want to have a discussion about this.
Thanks so much, Heather, for all those important questions. I see a lot of hands. I'll make a list. Maybe I just want to ask you one question before I go to the floor. We have spent some time this morning talking about the meaning of the word global. It came up at least twice. When we say world history, what does that word mean to you? What is the word of world history?
What is the world of world history? So I don't think of it, and I think maybe you know this actually, but I don't necessarily think of the world as like a place. I think of world history as a way of thinking. And so it's, a way of thinking beyond boundaries, I guess. And whether it's chronological or whether it's, temporal or whether it's geographical, I see world history as a field that allows you to ask different questions because you both read widely and study, specifically. I mean, by the way, I took over the world history program from Pat Manning at Northeastern, but I don't necessarily, I really like Pat Manning, but I don't necessarily agree with his ideas about world history. I mean, world historians don't all agree, but I do think that you have to know a lot about place or places, but that also it's a way of thinking on different, and actually Marnie's essay on scales is so important here. It's a way of being able to move back and forth between scales. Long way of saying it's not a place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I hope we can get back to the question on genealogy at some point. I'll go to Professor Berg first.
Thank you. I think your project on the kind of global history of the anti-colonial movements is really interesting. I really look forward to reading more of the work of your PhD students and your own work. I'm just going to say first, Ken Pomerantz never distinguished between world history and global history.
Right.
So I think that's really significant. So I don't think, I think we could look, maybe it's something we just shouldn't be worrying too much about. But that said, the issue you raise is an institutional issue. Mm-hmm. It is about which universities or which departments are more important than others, who has the money and who hasn't got the money. And so that's something I think we could discuss further. How do you get the grants? Do you talk about world history or do you talk about global history? So the institutional framework is what's important, not whether we're quibbling about words.
Right.
Sorry. Okay. And now I think I probably lost my. But I think we could explore more on that. I think I think I'll just leave it at that. There were so many other questions, and I'll just leave that.
Well, I just want to make it clear. Is this on? Yeah, okay. I just want to make it clear that I don't differentiate between world and global history. Like I do use them as two, sometimes I say global and sometimes I say world. I do think it is an institutional issue. I think it's also a hierarchy issue in academia. I still believe and train my PhD students that you don't go out there and say, I do world history. You actually have to show that you do something in a field, because the job market actually still doesn't recognize world history as a legitimate field, except for as a teaching field. It's not most places. But there were a few like world history jobs. In fact, mine, the one that I got, but that was to direct a world history program. So I still think that it's, and I think this would actually be true with global history as well. You don't primarily say, well, I'm a global historian first. Usually you're applying for a position in a field that has been advertised, and you also do, you take it from a global perspective. I don't know. So the institutional part of it is really important, and I think it is a key in how we need to train our PhD students who are doing this as well.
Thank you. I'll go to Professor Woolf. Daniel.
Released from the burdens of chairing, I actually get to ask a question now. I agree with you. I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, the whole history of the discipline of history in the last 60 years has been a series of fissionable moments in which subfields break off and then subfields break off from that, history of, women's history going to gender history and the history of sexuality and so forth. Your second point in response to Maxine on the issue of there being no jobs and people having to hire in a particular period or country is also true. The same is true of history, historiography, and theory. I was always hired as a Tudor Stuart historian. But it seems to me that there are a couple of reasons, perhaps illegitimate, for distinguishing, and I think they are in many ways distinctions without a difference. One is, again, this wish of a newer subfield to distinguish itself from oh, that's old style
Mhm.
world history, and also to position it in the way that in the history of historiography, the latest movement has always tried to relegate the previous movement
Mhm.
to some kind of the way early modern humanist historians tried to relegate medieval chroniclers to the
Mhm.
dustbin of historiography. So I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. So I think some global historians might position quote unquote old style world history as being, some kind of variant of Toynbee, perhaps in the argument that it is trying to tell a kind of story of the history of the world, vision Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, 1614, that sort of thing, which is not a fair interpretation of what world history actually does at all. But I think there is this idea, and in a sort of post-Leotardian suspicion of master narratives
Mhm.
world or globe, I think that's partly what is attaching to world history, whereas global now comes with a whole bunch of other things that I think original world history didn't might have dealt with but didn't make a big fuss about, including
Mhm.
things like slavery, colonialism,
Mhm.
imperialism, and so forth that were probably there, and certainly there in works by Jerry Bentley and William McNeill and so forth, but they've become more conceptualized and ossified in global history and been used, I think, to say, well, we're global historians because we care about these things. We're not telling some kind of, old-fashioned narrative of the convergence of the
Mhm.
world into modernity.
No, I totally agree. And I think that there is a strong distaste for what Sebastian Conrad also called the old world history, that it was a macro thing that was all synthetic and stuff. But that brand of world history hasn't been around for a long time. And so I think, I guess my question, and I get, so if you say global history, then you've basically, you don't have to deal with that at all. I'm just not sure that I think that's a good plan, because I do think that the field of world history and the historiography of world history was critical in helping to bring about this global turn. So I just feel like it should be acknowledged because it has problems, but also because it had things to say. And so I just, by sidestepping that whole issue, I'm just not sure that we're doing ourselves intellectual favors, I suppose, and possibly not institutional as well.
Sorry, could I just come back on that? I do think that moment around Ken Pomerantz's book, the debate on the Great Divergence, that was a very significant turning point. And the economic historians, it gripped them. And I ran a conference in 2009 called Writing the History of the Global, Challenges for the 21st Century. Wasn't published until 2013 because there were so many big cheeses in it and they gave me a lot of trouble. But what was really, what I also did there is we interviewed a whole number of historians and asked them what thinking about the global did for them in changing the way that they were thinking about and writing history. I mean, people from Linda Colley, all sorts of people, it's still on the website, all those interviews. So it was kind of this period of a whole range of historians who hadn't really thought about writing history in that way started to rethink. And I think the challenge of Ken Pomerantz's book was really significant for not just the economic historians. For them, it was a really big switch because all they had been doing for ages was more and more minuscule econometric history. And suddenly they started to talk to people who were not just talking about the productivity of cotton mules in one small part of Lancashire, but now they were talking to those who knew about the Ottoman Empire and China. I mean, it was just so exciting to be in big rooms like this, full of people with historians of all parts of the world talking together and comparing, and that was something that had not happened in economic history for, well, I don't know when, but certainly.
I completely agree, and anyone who's taken my historiography course will start banging their head against the desk after several weeks of the California school. But the Great Divergence was very important. And I think not just, I mean, yes, for economic history, but books like that helped people think and ask questions in different ways. And I feel like that is what world history can do for you. I mean, and this is why we read in, Chinese history or in, big connective histories, not because we're trying to do that ourselves, especially as young scholars, but to think in these broad ways that might lead us to asking different things. So, very important. California School, extremely important.
Thank you. We'll go online to Heidi Turek.
All right. As you'll see, Heather, our papers really complement each other. Heidi's up next. I'm wondering if you can say more about World History Centers beyond your own experience. Where else are they? When were they founded? More in the US than elsewhere, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Northeastern used to have one, but that shut down before I got there, and we never opened it up again. It was a major source of conflict at my university before I got there. I could, talk privately about that. But there is, when Pat Manning went to Pitt, he brought they opened a World History Center there at Pitt, and it still exists. There's the Global History Institute, which is different, I think, than the World History Center. Pat's vision of the World History Center at Northeastern, and to a certain extent at Pitt, did have a lot to do with teaching, and a lot to do with a mission to teach responsible, I don't know, that's my terrible word, world history at the secondary level, which I do think is important, by the way, and don't think that we should necessarily divorce ourselves from, teaching the survey, because it's done a lot. And it's done pretty badly, honestly, in many cases. And so, Heidi, I think there's not very many. I don't know of another World History Center outside of Pitt. And then there are, outside of Queens, Amitava, is there anything else in Canada that's a Global History Institute? And then there's the Weatherhead Center at Harvard, but that's not, I don't know, it is global. Do they have a center? I don't know. Utrecht, okay.
Yeah. And there are chairs in global history in Canada, but there is no center as far as I know, unless Heidi knows. Go ahead.
No, okay. So it's a great question. At the moment, I don't think there is much activity in the US around World History Centers that are sort of in that vision of both teaching and research. However, at Harvard, the Weatherhead Institute is fantastic for sponsoring scholars and conferences and research and stuff.
Thank you. I'll go to Marnie.
Thank you so much. I love all the questions. Two, you can either be the servant of the rules or you can be the maker of them. What would you like to see happen with world history and global history? And are you seeking a rapprochement between the two of them? So that's my first question. Or do you want one to subordinate the other? I'm really interested to hear what you think the future should be.
A colonial history of global versus
That's right.
world.
World historians taking over global historians, who knows? An anti-colonial response by global historians to historians. The second is the notion of teaching being a source for historiography. And that may be being underappreciated in historiography. So there have been some really great global and world histories that have come out of the survey. and out of teaching.
Mhm.
So have we got a problem, in recognising the breadth of historiographical sources there, and saying that teaching doesn't count as one of those things? So I want to get your view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe I should start there because I've already sort of forgotten the first question, although I had an answer to it. With the teaching, I think it is, I'll just use myself as an example. If I hadn't started teaching the World History Survey, basically not knowing anything and having like 5 minutes to prepare, because I defended my dissertation on August 14th and then started teaching, 2 weeks later. If I hadn't taught the World History Survey, I'm sure that I never would have even been interested in the field of world history, because even at that level of teaching, I realized some connections as I was teaching. Oh my God, I never thought about that before. And so, I do think there's a reason why many of the older generation of world historians actually started out with their questions from teaching. And why should we be ashamed of that? I think that's a good thing. The first question was, what do I see? What do I want to have happen? I'm okay with what other people want to do. I personally, though, do not think there is, if there is a difference between global and world history, I don't know what it is. And so I guess that's not a wish. That's just a statement. I think they're very similar. I do have questions though about what is the sustainability of having discrete world history PhD programs? I don't think it's going to happen right away, but I wonder about, is what happened to women's studies going to happen to world history once, when women's studies became totally mainstream and everybody, and doing you didn't need to be protected by a women's studies department to do gender history. Is that what's happening with world history after the global turn? Maybe it is. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm wondering.
Right. I see a number of hands. I'll go to Julia first, and then can we go to the graduate students in the room? And Sven. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I think it's an old historiographical debate in a way with this world versus global history, and I think I agree with both sides in the sense of words may not matter; they're just words. But on the other hand, words are attached to intended meanings. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to keep in sight with the last kind of point you've got on the board there of, how do we train future global historians? And I think that what we're seeing increasingly in history departments around the world maybe is an increasing kind of let's just throw in the word global, throw in the word world, and job done. We're transcending Eurocentrism. We're thinking about global processes, maybe less so the second one actually, and I'm not sure that actually those things are really following through. So I guess there's that kind of need to kind of keep in sight, the intended meaning and the intended kind of objectives of both of these fields, as it were.
That's a good point, and it's I'm not an advocate of just throwing in the word because I think that this sidesteps the sort of, world history as a field is interesting and innovative and also problematic, right? So, I feel like that all has to be understood as we go out and make these broad connections and say these big things about places. And I feel like when you don't have that grounding in the historiography of that field, then you've missed something important, actually. So I don't know if that actually speaks to what you were saying, but that I agree. When I first got to Boston, some of you may have known Bruce Maslish, but he was still living when I got there, and he he emailed me and brought me to his house. And he was like, what's the difference between world and global history? Because they are not the same. And I was like, and Bruce had very definite opinions about the differences between world and global history. And I completely disagree. But, and I nicely, politely told him that I don't agree. But I think that debate, like the Bruce Maslish debate, is pretty much over. And so, he said it was global history was globalization and world history was, I don't know, big systems or something like that. So I think you're right that the intent behind the words matter, but I'm not totally sure that everybody who's talking about global history thinks about that. Like, what's the intent? Yeah.
If we can take a couple of questions from the audience before coming back to the panel, I'll go to Edward, then Ksenia.
Hi, my name is Edward Tchaikovsky. I'm a PhD student here, and my supervisor is Dr. Woolf. My question is actually in response to your very last question. It's a question that Dr. Chowdhury has asked at least once in his class before. To what extent do you think that the lack of knowledge of globally used languages amongst graduate students might threaten the viability of global history programs at the graduate level?
Oh, I mean, language is so important. I think that you must have languages in order to do global history. And then I think some of them, like just if you, as an example, Jamil Aden's Anticolonialism and, oh my gosh, whatever, Jamil Aden's book. How many people speak both Turkish and Japanese? The questions that can be asked from that. I had a student that Pat and I both worked with, was a native Chinese speaker and also had Arabic and did Shuangwen, actually. She did amazing stuff. I think that language is key to being able to continue to delve into new questions and new ways of thinking. And those of you who speak other languages, which I assume is most, you also know that you don't think the same in it from the point of view of a different language. So I do think it's critical. It will depend, though, from project to project. But I do think it has to be critical. Yeah.
Thank you. Ksenia?
Thank you. I'm going to try to answer a few of your questions and kind of ask my own. And I was Amitava's student as a master's student here. So hearing, is there a difference between world and global history, just like sends me into a panic. But I'm wondering, and this is maybe a little bit cheeky, if saying that there isn't a difference is kind of admitting that global history is one after all. Obviously, it exists as a critique of world history. And so presumably, if world history has improved and no longer has the same issues that necessitated a new field of global history, then we should just subsume it under the global. Yeah. And but also to your last question to your question on historiography, one of the things that you noted in one of your previous answers was that even if the historiography is problematic, it's really important to know that literature anyways. And I'm wondering, what do world history students miss out on if they're not studying post-colonial theory or subaltern studies histories, which I see as very central to the historiography of global history, but which in my mind maybe are not central to the historiography of world history. And maybe that's just because I don't know a lot about what world history looks like now. But I also wonder if the kind of old world history that maybe Sebastian Conrad talked about is not like coming back in a big way in America. Like I feel like there are a lot of universities that are bringing back maybe in interdisciplinary courses that are intersected with political science or international relations, things that are the same kind of jingoistic Cold War era world history topics and issues that global history was kind of trying to move beyond. So yeah, there was a question there, I think, maybe.
If they're doing that, it's not world history. I mean, I don't know if they're doing that. I don't think it's associated with the field of world history. Your first question about, or the cheeky one about global history. If global history has one, they don't know, right? So my point is, if you don't know you won, then what difference does it make? So I'm not. I don't think. I think there's two parallel conversations happening that need to be brought into better conversation. Not whether one should win or not. I just think that they're missing each other, and yet they're so related. So that's my point. I'm not saying I'm not on a team necessarily, although I guess I am directing a world history program. But I'm not saying that one is better than the other. And I just think there is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of what world history has been for the last 30 years. Yeah.
Rants about the world history textbook he's currently writing.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues is still like, how do we fit equal space and time for all these different eras and periods and geographies? And I'm wondering, does world history not still aim to be kind of completionist in that way?
Not world history as a research field. No. When you teach teaching world history and teaching the World History Survey is a whole other kettle of fish, related sometimes to the field of world history, sometimes, which I think is worthy of discussion, but it is not the research field that I'm talking about. Yeah.
We'll get back to the speakers. I'll just make a comment before I go to Sven, and it's an autobiographical comment, I would think, because I do hold a position on this question.
Mm-hmm. I know.
And I was trained in a world history program, which was at that time the only one in the country, in the US, that you directed, Heather. Wrote my qualifying exams on world history, defending world history, making a case for world history, and then taught here for years. And then I went to Harvard to Sven's Weatherhead Initiative. Is it a center now, or is it initiative? Okay. And week after week of papers and discussions and going to that Chinese place in Porter Square. Do you still go there? And it made me think about one thing that I thought was different. There is a lot we could say about old 1960s and 70s world history. That's easy to dismiss that now. But even if we are talking about Pomeranz, and even if we are talking about Bin Wang and others, what I've always thought is there is always a pre-given unit of analysis. When we speak of world history or when we self-identify as a world historian, there is a pre-given unit of analysis, a world that exists, a world in its own, in Marnie's words from our 2004 book. I think the attempt of global history is to move away from that, to question the very existence of a pre-given unit of analysis. And that's where I draw the difference, because any unit of analysis that is predetermined comes with a baggage that becomes so heavy that it ultimately sinks. And that's how I do not necessarily disagree that world history as you practice today and what we are calling global history, I do not think they are different, but that question of unit of analysis, that question of organizing scheme is where it gave me the pause about 7-8 years ago. So that's a comment. Don't answer. Let's go to Sven.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for initiating what is a really important discussion. And look, if world history is your kind of history, then I think, yes, there's not much of a difference between what global historians do and what world historians do. And it's, perhaps a futile discussion to decide which one is better or which term to use. I would be fine to go either way. But if I think about myself, so I came to global history or world history, I came to it not through teaching, but through my own research, which pushed against the boundaries of what I had been trained in, namely the history of the United States. And when I pushed against these boundaries, there were a number of concepts available that I could have appropriated. One was, which was then very fashionable and very much pushed for by this wonderful historian at NYU, Thomas Bender, who advocated for transnational history, for taking national histories as the starting point and then thinking about them in kind of a greater global context. But then I looked at my own work and it just didn't seem to quite fit the bill, because this was not about one part of the world, you know, being related to some other part of the world, but it was really about the world as such, and the problem I was analyzing came out of this interconnected world itself. And I guess then I encountered works like Ken Pomerantz's, and so I attached myself to the label of global history also because the way how I did know world history was not your world history, but were these kind of civilizational accounts of everything that ever happened under the sun in the past 5,000 years. And I did definitely know that I'm never going to do that. Right. And I've lived up to that promise.
Agreed.
So that's how I got stuck with this particular label, but you know, it was never very important to me. And you know, in some ways, I just don't care at all how we call what we do, except that I think we all agree that the old-fashioned history that was largely contained within nation states and the imagined long-term histories, that this is not the way forward for how to do history. So we all agree on that.
Completely agree.
Then, so I haven't been teaching global history for 20 years, but for 12 years or 13 years. And we always start out with historiography. So we do a lot of readings. And I try to teach my students the differences, not just between world history and global history, but also I try to teach them a transnational approaches to history. And you forgot something really important, namely that Bruce Maslach did not advocate global history, but the new global history. And there was a journal by that title, The New Global History. I was on this board. I don't know why, but he just made me a member of the board. And
he had a way of bringing people in.
And there was, because he was not a global historian, because he said global history's big mistake is that it starts before 1945, because global history only started in 1945, according to Bruce Maslach. Once people went into space and could see planet Earth, and once they could destroy planet Earth, that's when global history started, and therefore it was the New Global History, and there was the Journal of New Global History, and there were conferences of the Initiative on New Global History and all of that. Okay, so there are lots of efforts to institutionalize all kinds of ways of looking at this history beyond the nation state. But look, I mean, this goes also back to the last comment. I mean, if we do a history that pushes against the beyond the nation state, that embraces archival research, and that focuses on specific sets of issues that we deem to be important, and not just like everything that happened under the sun, then, I don't care if this comes under the label of world history, or global history, or new global history, or transnational. It doesn't matter, because what we should look at is if the questions that we ask are actually being answered in a way that we find persuasive through this particular approach. I think there's, this is important for another reason, and that is we're in a terribly weak position. As was alluded to a couple of times already, this way of looking at history is not deeply institutionalized in the United States. And there's almost no funding available for this kind of history, nor for that matter for any other kind of history. So it probably makes sense to bundle our forces. And now we are encountering a world in which the kind of history we do in some parts of the world is literally seen as treason. So we are encountering political forces that are just way more threatening than the finer differences between what modern day world history does and modern day global history. And so I don't think anybody should conquer anybody else, even though Marnie may be thinking, we're going to win out here. But I'm exhausted here. So I think we should really, think about how to move this project together jointly. And one very weak part of this project is the training of PhD students, because really, except for you, nobody has this as a real established field. We don't have a single professor of global history at Harvard. We don't have a field in global history. So it's
But
not
there
like,
are PhD students who are doing this work at Harvard and elsewhere, and it is more possible to do it now at places like
there's
Harvard,
terrible excitement
Columbia.
about it.
Yeah.
Yes, the students
Yeah.
want to do it, but that's what I'm saying. There's a mismatch in a way between what the students want to do and what we institutionally can offer them, and also with how the job market is structured.
Right.
Okay, quick follow-up from Maxine.
I just want to take up that note on treason. I, together with Pat Hudson, have just, in this past year, been accused of the treason of the intellectuals. So this is in the daily press in the UK, and of traducing our country because we wrote about the impact of slavery on Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's alive and well.
Well, treason is one word, the other is unpatriotic. We all know who said that in 2002, doing global history is unpatriotic. Somebody said that in the US. I won't go there. Joe, then last word from John.
Technology. I have a tiny point and then a bigger point. The tiny point is I wonder about the role of data. So Utrecht is the one department where global history means longue durée indices of climate, wages, prices. And I wonder about this deluge of data that we expect from the Seychot group that I mentioned earlier, and that threatens to come from computer science departments and data science departments who don't have the same concerns that we have, but have the mechanisms to create unlimited numbers of publications with high interest and high attention, possibly displacing us and displacing the interests of provosts and funders. So that's a risk. Happy to say more about that, but that's the tiny point. The bigger point is, I wondered if I could share an autobiographical point of view from my extracurricular life. When I'm not a history professor or a data science professor, I'm a Sunday school teacher. And I have been a Sunday school teacher in the Unitarian Church, which has a kind of shadow relationship with world history, which I've learned about. In the process of, I've taught a Unitarian curriculum that includes teaching young teenagers, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, about world history since the beginning of time. And it's a curriculum that was developed probably originally in the 1960s, and then refined in the 1990s, sometimes by colleagues who were also teaching in history departments. And so I kept on running into these elders who were part of world history, definitely not global history. And they were teaching the 5,000-year history courses with emphasis on questions about like the rise and fall of empires and their intersections and discontinuities in time. But they're like definitely not Rostow, right? Definitely not advising government. And then on Sundays, they were going and developing these courses about world religions and how much they share in common, right? And this is really quite unique in the ecosystem, but it is a kind of like, when I step back from it, I'm like, wow, that's a historical phenomenon. You have these 60s era white intellectuals who have seen civil rights, embrace it, embrace the possibility of the Enlightenment of all traditions. They want to create a vessel for it. The vessel that they create is world history. And it's not nuanced enough to contain subaltern perspectives or decolonial perspectives, but they really want it to be, right? So like they almost end too soon. Like had they brought up the question of like, is Marxism a religion? Is Gandhi a new form of spirituality? How does that impact Unitarian Universalism? Then it gets like really juicy. But like It's too much. So they just cut everything off in like the year 1500, and they're like, that's it. Then we invented Unitarianism. You're done. But I find that a compelling and interesting question mark about like the larger geopolitical identity of world history. I don't think it's one. I think those are the same people who are running the Carl Jung reading group at the Unitarian Church. And they had like a really interesting relationship with the church in India, where they supported orphanages, but they were definitely not missionaries in India preaching Unitarianism. They were more interested in learning about what their Indian brothers and sisters had to say to them, since the 1960s at least. So yeah, and it helps to remember that there's a longer trajectory. Emerson got banned from the Harvard Div School because he said maybe the Hindus have something going on in 1840? It was really early. Not continuous, of course. I'm just curious about that. I'm not going to write about it, but maybe that's an interesting question mark for somebody to.
Well, I was just thinking about interesting dissertation topic for somebody later. But also, Joe, to your first point about DH or data, you said data. No, I know. But in terms of thinking about the larger world of data, one of the things that Northeastern buys a lot of stuff, but they have spent a lot of money on getting computational social sciences and digital humanities entrenched in the university. But our PhD program requires 2 courses in digital humanities. And it has really, and then there's the option of a certificate, which now almost all of our students do. And I have been amazed at the way that those tools are also transforming the questions that our PhD students can ask, and also taking them outside of the academy in successful ways. Yeah. So.
Joan, you have the last word.
Heather, I have a question for you, but before I get to it, I want to say, one, I agree with you that there's no practical payoff in trying to draw a distinction between world history and global history, and I want to agree with the recently mentioned notion that there are increasing costs to sectarianism amongst scholars who do anything other than inculcate patriotism with their teaching and their scholarship. And in that environment, it seems that unity rather than vociferousness is advisable. But here's my question for you. Let's suppose, and I'm impressed by the stress that you put on historiography and versing oneself in historiography. Let us suppose that the next generation of scholars interested in anti-colonial movements, as you are, actually was well-versed in world history historiography. You say that so far those scholars are not. They don't come out of that historiography. Let's suppose that changed and they were versed in that historiography. What difference do you imagine that would make? What different questions, to use a phrase that you often use, would they be asking?
That's a good question. You'll notice that I stopped my paper right then because I'm not totally sure that I've worked that out yet. And I'm not so sure that that particular question matters that much. I think, the question about where does the historiography of anti-colonialism as a global phenomenon come from? I'm struck by the fact that there aren't very many world historians involved. I'm also a world historian, but I'm not sure what to make of that yet. And I am worried that it is a sign of the weakness of the field or the small size of the field right now. I don't know. I haven't worked it out, but I that is what I am actually going to do. And Resmanella and Elizabeth Leake and I are doing a edited volume called Explaining International History, and I'm writing the essay on world history and its relationship. So to be continued, don't know yet.
Thanks, Heather. Your paper really generated some very useful discussion. You also helped us form a coalition government in the sake of unity. So we'll now have a break. We are back at 4 o'clock.